This is the Rose Room of the Algonquin Hotel in New York City. It looks today much as it did in the 1920s. It is a room for talk and laughter, but it is missing its star players, the 10 or so men and women who made their mark as humorists, journalists, and playwrights in a single decade after World War I. They had an extraordinary influence on each other and on the literature, drama, and opinion of their time. They came to be known as the Algonquin Round Table.
Hello, I'm Heywood Hale Broun. When I was a boy, my father, the newspaperman Heywood Broun, came here for lunch almost every day. He came here to be with his friends, lively talkers who kept each other afloat with an exchange of wit and affection.
There was tiny Dorothy Parker, the most quoted writer of her day, her sweet-natured friend, the humorist Robert Benchley, Harold Ross, soon to be founder of the New Yorker, George S. Kaufman and Edna Ferber, a pioneer playwriting team, Harpo Marx, a silent clown on stage but a talker at lunch, and many more. Their talents were smart talk, wit, and style. Their skill was playing with the language. World War I was over. The boys were coming home. It was a blissful time to be alive, to be American, and to be young. November 11th, 1918, Armistice Day. Actress Helen Hayes, who later married into the Algonquin group, was there.
It was a wonderful period and a fierce period because we had just got out of that war. In fact, Armistice Day, I remember I ran out into the street and ran up Broadway, and there at the corner of 42nd Street in the Knickerbocker Hotel, I saw a window open and a crowd all looking up, and there was Caruso singing Over There. We had made the world safe for democracy, and we earned a whole new extra helping of freedom, and we were just gobbling it up.
It was in that unique moment of confidence that the Round Table came into being. Among those who returned from the war was a group of journalists who had become the core of the table.
My parents, Ruth Hale and Heywood Broun, were there as war correspondents for the New York and Chicago Tribunes.
They met Private Harold Ross reporting for the Stars and Stripes, along with Captain Franklin Pierce Adams, one of New York's best-known columnists, and Sergeant Alexander Wilkin, drama critic of the New York Times.
The Algonquin Round Table really began as a stunt, a way of bringing Wolcott down a peg.
When he returned from the war, Wolcott boasted about his military adventures so often and so loudly that his friends grew tired of listening. He began every sentence with,
"When I was in the theater of war."
Irritated with his pomposity, the press agent Murdoch Pemberton lured Wolcott here with the promise of an ace pastry chef. The idea was to hold a sort of roast at which a number of critics and journalists from around town would come and poke fun at him.
The attempt to humiliate Wolcott backfired. He was flattered by the attention. As for the rest of the group, they had a wonderful time. What started as a 2-hour roast became a 10-year lunch. Mark Connolly was the last surviving member.
The Round Table was made up of people who, first of all, admired the work of the other people in the group, and then found themselves very fond of those who were performing the work, and they became friends, and it was a goodly fellowship of well-known people.
Outspoken and outrageous, they quoted each other freely in their daily columns. They shared an irreverent view of life and an appreciation of malice.
Mrs. Parker, have you heard the news? Calvin Coolidge is dead.
Really? How can they tell?
All the things I like are either immoral, illegal, or fattening.
Being an old maid is like death by drowning. Not an altogether unpleasant sensation once you cease to struggle.
I like your bald head, Mark. It feels just like my wife's behind.
Why, so it does. So it does.
Only working women were welcome at the table. This included many actresses, among them Margalo Gilmore.
I was quite young at the time, and I was in a very successful play called The Famous Mrs. Fair. And By chance, I met a man called Mark Connolly, and he asked me to lunch at the Round Table. And that started the whole biz. I went there every day except Saturdays and Sundays. Had the time of my life. It was my laughing years.
It was the last time in America when the written word was paramount. 19 daily newspapers flourished in Manhattan and 6 more in Brooklyn. New Yorkers devoured books and magazines, and above all, they loved the theater. 85 theaters thrived in Times Square alone. Columnists and critics wielded enormous influence, and the witty writers who lunched at the Algonquin were the most successful and quotable of the tastemakers. The Algonquin was situated in the heart of the theater district and close to the newspaper offices where most of the group worked. Frank Case, the owner of the hotel, loved writers and made them feel very much at home. Alexander Wolcott became the ringleader of the group. An important and powerful critic, he specialized in discovering new talent. Fred Astaire and his sister Adele were obscure hoofers until Wolcott wrote about them. He championed the Marx Brothers when they opened on Broadway. He promoted Helen Hayes and Ruth Gordon when they were teenage ingenues.
He not only was at the Round Table, but he was right above the Round Table. Wolcott wrote his reviews for the New York Times right in the suite at the head of the stairs, and all of us would sit out in the sitting room and wonder, was it good, was it bad, you know? And then he'd come steaming out when he'd finished.
Wolcott was a first-rate critic at the time, and he was also a very witty man in a rather cruel way.
Whenever anyone made a pompous remark, everyone had to rise and bow to the speaker. They finally gave that up in Wolcott's case, or they would never have finished their lunch.
At one time, Wolcott weighed 255 pounds with an ego to match. He was always rude, testing to the hilt the affection of friends. Forced to sit through a long-winded story, he snapped,
"Excuse me, my leg has gone to sleep. Do you mind if I join it?"
Someone once asked young Wolcott, "What do you want to be when you grow up?"
"When I grow up, I want to be a fabulous monster."
And that is exactly what he became. Dorothy Parker became a poet.
Oh, life is a glorious cycle of song, a medley of extemporanea, and love is a thing that can never go wrong, and I am Marie of Romania.
When Dorothy Parker sat down to lunch at the Algonquin for the first time, she was 26 years old. She had been discovered by Frank Crowninshield, the editor of Vanity Fair. He bought one of her poems, and she was hired by Vogue as a caption writer.
Brevity is the soul of lingerie, said the petticoat to the chemise.
Crowninshield described her. Her figure was slight, her eyes with their tranquil and intensely thoughtful expression, a curious mixture of hazel and green. She was reticent, self-effacing and preternaturally shy. She wore horn-rimmed eyeglasses, which she removed quickly if anyone spoke to her.
Men seldom make passes at girls who wear glasses.
Dorothy Parker became the most quoted woman in New York. She was known for her quick wit.
At birth, the devil touched my tongue.
When challenged to use the word horticulture in a sentence, Mrs. Parker said,
"You can lead a horticulture, but you can't make her think."
Asked if she'd enjoyed herself at a party, she responded,
"Enjoyed myself? One more drink and I'd have been under the host."
Born Dorothy Rothschild, she married a stockbroker, Edwin Pond Parker III, in 1918.
In order to change my name.
She and her husband separated in 1922.
I require 3 things in a man. He must be handsome, ruthless, and stupid.
Dottie was a 15-year-old girl romantically. She was always falling in love with some bum, somebody who was handsome and had the romantic responsibility of a hoodlum.
Dottie was in bed, propped up with pillows, and Benchley and Sherwood, and everybody was there. And you'd say, "How is she?" And she'd had an abortion. So we all held her hand, said, looking so pretty, and where'd you get that nightgown and everything? And we all knew, and we all knew who the father was, and he was there too, and he was looking kind of troubled and didn't know whether to take bows or not. But that's right upstairs, if these walls could talk.
After the abortion, she said,
It serves me right for putting all my eggs in one bastard. Something happened to the light verse writers, especially the ladies among us. We let it be known that our hearts broke much oftener than the classic ones.
Dorothy Parker was like a weeping spaniel. Her eyes looked as if she'd been crying all night long. And she had a tendency to commit suicide, which never caught on, fortunately.
Eventually once had to bawl around and says, Dottie, you know, you can hurt yourself seriously doing that. You've got to stop it.
She took a bleak view of life and tried to kill herself 5 times. Mrs. Parker yearned her living, but was able to translate her vulnerability into verse.
Men, they hail you as their morning star because you are the way you are. If you return the sentiment, they'll try to make you different. And once they have you safe and sound, they want to change you all around. Your moods and ways they put a curse on. They'd make of you another person. They cannot let you go your gait. They influence and educate. They alter all that they admired. They make me sick. They make me tired.
Dorothy Parker was promoted to drama critic. Her colleagues at Vanity Fair were Robert Benchley and Robert Sherwood. Sherwood, all 6'7" of him, arrived for his job interview in his war uniform, a Scottish kilt. Benchley, too, had always used humor as a form of rebellion. In his senior year at Harvard, he failed an examination in international law by answering a question about Newfoundland fishing rights from the point of view of the fish.
his first story for Crown and Shield was called No Matter From What Angle You Looked at It, Alice Brookhausen was a girl you would hesitate to invite into your own home.
Robert Benchley was considered one of the most charming and beguiling men in New York. He seemed incapable of malice and was called the president of chivalry. His closest friend, Dorothy Parker.
We always called each other Mr. Benchley and Mrs. Parker.
A stranger who saw them together asked Wolcott, would that be Mrs. Benchley?
It would be if there wasn't already a Mrs. Benchley.
Married to his high school sweetheart, Gertrude Darling, Benchley and his wife led separate lives. Of sex, he observed,
We tried it twice, and it worked both times.
Jobs at Vanity Fair were prestigious but low-paying. All the threesome could afford at lunch for the first year were eggs. Still, Robert Sherwood remembered those days as a long blur of laughter. One of the first events that the whole Algonquin crowd produced was an evening's entertainment.
The chauve-souris, the Russians' chauve-souris, was the hit of the town. And the Round Table Bunch got up something called the no-souris. And this was a show that they worked on. They wrote sketches, they rehearsed.
They went on stage and performed in their own skits, while big stars remained in the chorus and wrote the reviews.
Sherwood stood up and sang a number. Those who saw it said it was the greatest show ever seen. It was over.
Robert Benchley did his Treasurer's Report for the first time, and that performance launched his career as a comic actor and later as a film personality.
Mr. Rossiter, unfortunately, our treasurer, Mr. Rossiter, our treasurer, unfortunately is confined at his home tonight with a bad head cold. And well, the joke seems to be on me. Mr. Rossiter has pneumonia.
Meanwhile, the Vanity Fair days came to an abrupt end when Dorothy Parker wrote a harsh review of actress Billie Burke, wife of the powerful producer Florence Ziegfeld. Ziegfeld complained and Mrs. Parker was fired. Benchley and Sherwood resigned in solidarity. All three were snapped up by the editors of Life, then a humor magazine. Benchley wrote about drama, Sherwood reviewed film, and Mrs. Parker wrote verses called Hymns of Hate. Sherwood became a well-respected film critic. Reviewing Fool's Paradise in 1922, he wrote, "Leonard Merrick's story has been mutilated, deformed, truncated, disfigured, and beaten to a pulp. In other words, it has been made into a motion picture by Cecil B. DeMille." The editors of Life sent Sherwood to Hollywood to learn the truth about this sink of iniquity, this 20th century Sodom. After 10 days, he confessed, "I have attended no orgies, and as heaven is my witness, I have spared no effort in trying to locate them." He must not have been looking in the right places. It was hard not to notice the new temptations in the 20s. Women undid their corsets, shortened their skirts, and cut off their hair. It seemed that people were either dancing the Charleston or singing the blues. In spite of prohibition, everyone knew where to find a speakeasy or a bottle of bootleg gin. It was the decade of get rich quick. Chronicling all this for a readership numbering in the millions was Heywood Broun. He was a man of contradictions. In his column, he crusaded for social causes, but all the while he remained a member of the exclusive and restricted New York Racket Club. Wolcott said,
"Heywood looks like an unmade bed."
A tame insult by Wolcott's standards and relatively accurate.
I don't know if it's true that a passerby outside the Algonquin once mistook Heywood for a bum and handed him a dime, or whether he really kept a crumpled tuxedo in his desk drawer to wear on opening nights, although his tuxedo was always crumpled.
One thing I do know about him, though, is that he was a heavy gambler, and that his game was, or in view of his record, perhaps wasn't, poker. The future round tablers began playing during the war and never stopped. They played unsophisticated firehouse poker of the most conventional sort and enlivened the game with bad puns and ceremonial jokes. Franklin Pierce Adams gave the game a name, Thanatopsis.
Well, it means the consideration of death, actually. It was the Thanatopsis Chowder and Literary Club. It was a pretty elegant crowd, and that was all. As we were all literary people, we thought we ought to have literary names, so that's why we chose Thanatopsis. Wasn't it cute of us?
It was an appropriate name under the circumstances. Heywood once lost our home in a game, and FPA lost the money for his honeymoon.
Yes, I played poker with him. I was known as Father Christmas to the other players.
The Thanatopsis poker game went on upstairs at the Algonquin, where owner Frank Case gave them a room. Perhaps the best thing to be said about this poker game is that in a roundabout way, it did give birth to the New Yorker.
Ross had come back from the war, where he'd been editor of the Soldier's newspaper, and he wanted to start a metropolitan magazine that would cover New York, really, frankly, a metropolitan journal. And one of the recent joiners of the poker game was a fellow named Raoul Fleischman, who was very wealthy, and Raoul thought the idea of the New York was wonderful, and Raoul put several hundreds of thousands of dollars into the magazine and saw it through several very discouraging phases of development until it got on its feet and then, of course, became a gold mine.
We all thought the New Yorker was a big joke at first. Everybody at the round table was asked to contribute, and they did. And nobody thought it would go at all. But it did.
The first issue appeared February 21st, 1925, and it soon caught the eye of the smart and the stylish. Ross said the New Yorker was not written for the little old lady from Dubuque, but rather for the man who knew his way around town or wanted to. The stature of Ross's magazine grew as word went around about the brilliant galaxy of fresh young writers he unfailingly attracted. E.B. White wrote his incomparably simple but complex essays. Janet Flanner reported from the Paris of Hemingway and Fitzgerald. Ray Irwin gave the New Yorker the look. And James Thurber added his own extraordinary humor. When Ross complained that Thurber's women didn't seem to have any sex appeal, Mark Connolly said, they do for Thurber's men. Harold Ross was that rarity, an editor of genius. Eccentric, intuitive, and inspired, he had the surprising appearance of a small-town boy.
Ross, in his heart, regarded himself as kind of a rustic character. Ross had been a San Francisco wharf reporter, ship news reporter. And he always liked to assume a very tough air. He was a very gentle person, essentially.
He looked like a troglodyte man. He had all those crazy old funny features, and he wore his hair in a crew cut, long one. And I remember Ina Claire saying once, "Oh, I would love to walk barefoot through his hair."
In 1927, Ross hired Dorothy Parker as a book reviewer. Of one book, she said,
"It was written without fear and without research."
Of another,
"It must be a gift because no one would take it on any other terms."
Robert Benchley, too, joined the New Yorker in 1927. As drama critic, he never allowed himself to make wisecracks at the expense of actors. Once, however, the small boy in him triumphed. He attended a very bad melodrama called The Squall, in which a fervent gypsy girl proclaimed, "Me, Newbie, Newbie, good girl, Newbie, stay." As Benchley crept out of the theater, he was heard to say,
"Me, Bobby, Bobby, bad boy, Bobby, go."
While Ross and the New Yorker eventually gave many of the Round Tablers a home, it was Franklin Pierce Adams who had given them their start. This dancing dervish had made a name for himself long before the rest of them. Many of the group's quotes, poems, and epigrams were first published in his column, The Conning Tower. No one was paid for contributions. As E.B. White put it, FPA gave writers three precious gifts: discipline, a sense of gaiety, and a brief moment in the sun. Dorothy Parker said,
"He raised me from a couplet."
FPA, affecting the style of Samuel Pepys' 17th century diary, noted the comings and goings of the group. So to H. Broun's, where a great party and merry as can be, and we acted a play. I loved Mistress Dorothy Parker the best of any of them, and loathed to leave her. So to the Algonquin, where we fell to cards, and as merry an evening as I ever had. So home at near 4 in the morning.
We all had an island at one time up in Vermont, Neshabie Island. I was one of the 10 that bought the island, but Wolcott took so much charge of it. He would tell you when you could come there. Mind you, he was just one of the 10 of us. But I'd like to have the island, by the way, in August, from August the 5th to August the 12th, Alec. We were all supposed to have it for at least 1 week during the summer. Well, that's gone.
A pine-clad island a mile from shore, looking like a green tea cozy in summer.
The island was Wolcott's kingdom. He hoped that here in Vermont, his Algonquin friends could find a congenial retreat for a little work and a lot of talk.
Oh, Lake Bombazine. Yes, I visited Wolcott in Lake Bombazine. It was rather a royal command. And he went up there, and it was a woodsy place. It was a little too woodsy for me.
Most of the Round Table group went. Wolcott's house guests at Neshabie included many of his theatrical friends. Alfred Lunt and Lynn Fontanne gave poetry readings. Heywood was known to walk around in his underwear carrying a bottle of warm gin. Ruth Gordon spent her time there sailing. Wolcott's usual costume was silk pajamas, which were always falling off. Harpo Marx scared away the tourists by jumping stark naked out of the bushes, wielding an axe. Wolcott discouraged married couples from visiting Neshabie together. One couple who arrived together in spite of his wishes was Helen Hayes and her playwright husband Charles MacArthur, an occasional member of the group. Wolcott provided them with a bed so ancient and noisy it was named the Informative Double. Neshabie was a lot like summer camp. At 7 a.m. there was a compulsory swim in the icy waters of Lake Bomoseen. then a communal breakfast, at which Wolcott insisted on reading aloud choice extracts from his morning mail. After that, free time till lunch. Games were the rage, especially the ones Wolcott played well. They played card games and guessing games and their own variation of charades. Afternoons at Neshabe were reserved for swimming, badminton, and croquet. Wolcott loved croquet.
It's no game for the soft of sinew or the gentle of spirit. It is one of the most vicious and infuriating games ever devised. In croquet, you do not merely excel your neighbor, you damage him. My doctor forbids me to play unless I win.
Alec was a great shocking, too. You know what a shocking is? It's a marriage broker, you know. He was forever making marriages.
Wolcott's sex life appeared non-existent. Indeed, people questioned his sexuality. In college, he had performed in skits with himself as the female lead.
A lot of people thought he was a homo, which was anything but. He was about as male as anybody. He was forever falling in love, poor devil, and being frustrated. I fell in love with about every other woman of our particular group.
Before the war, Wolcott had wanted to marry Jane Grant, then his colleague at the Times.
He was very cantankerous, but was wildly enthusiastic about anything that caught his fancy.
When she married Harold Ross instead in 1920, he not only helped arrange their wedding, but moved into their home with them.
Well, it was a house they took. They took it with Wolcott. Wolcott, of course, took it over.
Alec insisted that we have open house, and it certainly was as open a house as you can possibly imagine. One Sunday, I remember feeding 30 unexpected guests.
Jane Grant said that Wolcott had a lot to do with making her marriage impossible. When Ross and Grant finally asked him to leave, Wolcott did it grudgingly.
I don't want to play in your yard if you won't be good to me.
Ross and Grant separated in 1928. Ross was totally immersed in the New Yorker, which Dorothy Parker called his bitch mistress. The marriage of my parents, Ruth Hale and Heywood Broun, also ended.
Heywood said the only real argument for marriage is that it's still the best method of getting acquainted. Theirs was what was called an open, progressive marriage, and was nothing of the sort. They both said they believed in free love, which was fashionable at the time in some circles, and they were wretched when they tried it. When they got married in 1917, Ruth insisted on striking out the word obey from the vow. There was no ring either, and at her insistence, no goddamn music, no marching to Mendelssohn.
Jane Grant and my mother were active feminists. In 1921, they founded the Lucy Stone League, named after a 19th century campaigner for women's rights. Lucy Stoners urged women to keep their individual identities by keeping their maiden names. My mother was president and Jane Grant treasurer. The league grew to 5,000 members in its heyday, and it was effective. In 1925, Esther Root became the first American woman ever to travel with a passport bearing her own name rather than that of her husband, FPA. Heywood also joined the league, one of only 2 men to do so at the beginning. My mother, as was so often the case, served as a catalyst for Heywood's radical leanings. Ruth bought a ramshackle, rat-infested farmhouse in Connecticut and regally instituted nude bathing, another one of those symbols of the free life in Hale Lake. Open-minded and experimental, both Ruth and Heywood tried psychoanalysis, as did most of the group, including Alec Wolcott.
I don't believe in Freud. I think it's dangerous to probe the human brain. The unconscious should remain just that, unconscious.
My mother also gave up psychoanalysis. She said, the only way to take care of yourself is to take enough gin at night to make you feel better and enough aspirin in the morning to get you over the hangover. Another modern woman, Nisa McMean, was an illustrator and the Round Table's femme fatale.
The most popular illustrator probably the country ever saw. At one time, you couldn't pick up a magazine or see a magazine on a newsstand that didn't have one of Nisa's pretty girls on the cover. She was perfectly beautiful, tall Amazonian sort of a person. And her studio at around 5 o'clock in the afternoon was populated, possibly by society people and our roughneck crowd.
And she would go right on with her work. She was doing covers for McCall's magazine, and very calm, very placid sort of person.
You'd see an awful lot of us up there. We hadn't seen each other since lunchtime, you know. So it was good to get together and renew old acquaintances and talk over old times and that sort of thing, because we wouldn't meet again maybe until after dinner, unless we had dinner together, which was also a frequent occasion. But anyway, it was usually headquarters for afternoon sessions. You might find Irving Berlin playing the piano, a very shy young fellow named Yasha Heifetz sitting up there drinking it in, because Yasha was only 21 then.
I ran into Mark Connolly on Fifth Avenue. He said, come on up to Nisa McMean's. And I was a little scared to do that and said, no, I thought not. But he insisted. And I was placed on a sofa in the corner and sat there. And nobody paid any attention to me. The room was full of celebrities, of course. I just watched them all going around like butterflies, flitting from one person to the other, and the music was going, and I was happy, just sitting there, but scared to death.
On this occasion, Wolcott served her a brandy Alexander, which went straight to her head.
And I sat there like a mouse, thinking, they're going to know I'm drunk if I don't say something. Oh, what do I do? I have to say something fast. So there was a pause, and I spoke. And I said, if anyone wants my piano, they're willing to it. And there was another heavier pause. And then George Kaufman said, that's very seldom of you, Helen.
George S. Kaufman, a successful playwright, worked at the New York Times alongside Wolcott as the editor of the drama section. He was scrupulous about not mentioning his own shows in his column. Once when asked by a press agent, how do I get my leading lady's name into your newspaper, Kaufman replied,
shoot her.
Kaufman wrote an astounding number of plays which highlighted the Broadway seasons through 4 decades. Among them were such hits as Of Thee I Sing, You Can't Take It With You, and The Man Who Came to Dinner. During the run of Thee I Sing, he sent a telegram to his leading man.
Watching your performance from the back of the house. Wish you were here.
His first collaborator was Mark Connolly.
I met George Kaufman because he was a drama reporter and drama editor for the New York Times, and I was gathering tidbits of news about Broadway for the old Morning Telegraph. And he and I found ourselves rubbing shoulders, more or less, each night at the theater. And we became friends and found we had a common enjoyment of each other's jokes. We liked each other, and we also found each of us wanted to write plays.
Kaufman and Connolly's first collaboration was Dulcie.
And this young actress named Lynn Fontanne made her first featured appearance in it, became a star overnight, and she set George and me off on a very happy, lucky career.
The opening night at English's Opera House, they said, who is that man disturbing the play? What is that? Somebody walked down the aisle, and the play was going right on. And then he walked back. And just as they were going over to him, and the play going right on, they walked down again. And somebody just said, please, you're disturbing the play. And it was George S. Kaufman.
Dulcie was a hit, and George and Mark Connolly continued to collaborate. Kaufman was also asked to write Coconuts for the Marx Brothers. They performed the lines as written, but added their own embellishments. Kaufman once hushed a friend backstage.
Shh, I think I just heard one of my lines.
Oh, among the mangoes where the monkey gang goes, you can see them do the little monkey doodle-doo.
We got along beautifully, except when there were some love scenes in the thing, and he would leave the auditorium when the love scenes were played because he said, I just can't listen to stuff like that. And we said, well, it's going to just be very important, and it's part of the play. It isn't just lovey-dovey stuff. Oh, well, no, he said, we'll get over that as soon as possible.
Though cool and worldly on the outside, Kaufman was highly neurotic. He panicked at the thought of heights, foreign travel, and germs. He washed his hands 40 times a day. Still, he did marry, and when it came to associations with pretty women, he sometimes took the risk. One such risk he took led him in the mid-30s to the front pages of the tabloids, when he was implicated in actress Mary Astor's divorce. She wrote in her diary that he was a perfect lover, but in the early 20s, no one would have guessed at these hidden fires. Kaufman wrote for the musical stage, but he was ambivalent about music. He once called a radio station during a music request show and asked for 5 minutes of complete silence. He told Irving Berlin that the song "I'll Be Loving You Always" seemed unrealistic. He suggested the line be changed to "I'll be loving you Thursday." Kaufman usually wrote with a collaborator, although he said,
"Collaboration is marriage without sex and subject to many vexations."
His first and most successful female collaborator was Edna Ferber, a Midwestern newspaper woman who'd won a Pulitzer Prize for her novel So Big.
I'm fond of Edna, but I don't like her.
Ferber was raised in Kalamazoo, Michigan. She dreamed of a career on the stage, but her family needed money, so she turned to writing. Her novels were unusual for their characterizations of strong, independent women. She wrote of her partnership with Kaufman,
"We were both work worshippers, both stage-struck, both punctual. We were neat to the point of fussiness. If a fleck of white paper appeared on the workroom carpet, we both pounced on it."
They wrote their first play, Minnick, in a matter of days.
George disliked food, sentiment, walking, any expression of emotion. Declarative and purposeful women like myself, and being interrupted while speaking. Me, I was more or less given to all these things.
Edna was the one woman who daily challenged Wolcott and had a verbal. She had her own set of armor that she carried right to the table with her. And Wolcott always knew he better damn well get his lance ready whenever Ferber picked hers up.
I'm getting pretty bloody sick of you, you little baby New Jersey Nero, trying to wear your pinafore like a toga.
By 1925, the Round Table was famous. Whereas at first they had been each other's best audience, now the sophisticated public paid attention to their every word.
Oh, I'm a night owl. I wake up as soon as the sun goes down. Oh, I'm a night owl. I start out and I do the town up round.
Once when the Ziegfeld Follies had opened to rapturous notices, Mark Connolly called the Round Table to attention and said with a gentle smile, "Well, shall we let it run?" People came to stare at them at lunch. The table was cordoned off with a velvet rope. Only amusing outsiders were invited in. The unknown Noel Coward was asked to lunch on his first visit to New York. He met Edna Ferber, who enjoyed wearing tailored suits.
You know, Noel Coward once said to me, "Edna, you look almost like a man in that suit." And I replied, "So do you, Noel. So do you."
A new arrival from Alabama was Tallulah Bankhead. She was only 17. Hotelier Frank Case was asked to keep an eye on her. "Either I keep an eye on Tallulah or I run this hotel. No man does both." She earned Wolcott's approval when she attended a play with him and commented,
"I think there's less to this than meets the eye."
Not everyone clamored for an invitation to lunch. Groucho Marx never sat at the Round Table. The admission fee was a viper's tongue and a half-concealed stiletto. It was sort of an intellectual slaughterhouse. Anita Luce, a contemporary writer, noted in her book, But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes,
The day never goes by that every one of his friends is not mentioned in FPA's literary column. And all of the public that is interested in literature enough to read it can find out what they have been doing every hour of the day or night.
Success brought the freedom to travel.
I want to be alone on this trip. I don't intend to talk to another man or woman. Just Alec Wolcott.
When Benchley first visited Venice, he wired home,
"Streets full of water. Please advise."
It was 1926, and the south of France was the place to be. There were picnics by the sea. They swam in the moonlight. gambled in casinos, and attended costume parties and formal dinners. The group was in demand everywhere. Some of the best parties and diversions were given in Antibes by Gerald and Sarah Murphy, celebrated hosts of the era. Dorothy Parker and Robert Benchley spent their Mediterranean days with the Murphys. Of this period, Anita Luce wrote,
"So then they all started to tell about a famous trip they took to Europe. And they had a marvelous time because everywhere they went, they would sit in the hotel and play cute games and tell reminiscences about the Algonquin. And I think it's wonderful to have so many internal resources that you never have to bother to go outside yourself to see anything."
Europe was seductive, deadlines were far away in New York, and no longer seemed to matter. Wolcott and Harpo Marx rented their own villa at Antibes. They contented themselves with the pranks they successfully practiced in New York. Wolcott wrote Edna Ferber,
"Here I am, leading the life of a rosy, middle-aged dolphin."
At home, the merry-go-round continued. Millionaire Averell Harriman loved to entertain the round table crowd and was entertained by them.
The thing that made them interesting was that they all had a purpose in life. They were writers or playwrights or producers or actors or something else. Alec Wolcott really helped me get to know many of these Algonquin people. He brought them to my house. He came up to Arden and saw the house, and it was never filled, and said, "Why don't we fill the house sometime? Let's do it next Thanksgiving." So they cooked up a party from starting on Wednesday afternoon, lasting till Monday morning, and I think about 40 people came, and we used to have a great deal of fun, pleasure. They were very ingenious in having games, and at Arden House there's a large 3-story music room. They put a net across it and played badminton. It was their invention. And of course, it was an extraordinary room for badminton because the ceiling was so high. We had a bowling alley, and you have to bowl in your stocking feet. I remember Heywood Broun's toe was sticking out of the end of his sock, and I always remember that because it was such a grotesque thing.
Dorothy Parker sometimes stayed a week not writing a line. Wolcott loved it. Heywood, ever the radical, complained that the group was being cast as performing seals. "Say something funny, Mr. Benchley," was a constant refrain.
Hemingway said, "And then you have the rich, and nothing is ever as it was again." The Long Island estates of the wealthy were dazzling settings for continuous parties.
To some, it seemed that their position as celebrities was beginning to threaten their talent. Robert Sherwood heard that if a man didn't write a play by the time he was 30, he'll never write one. And he was 29. He wrote to Edna Ferber, "Dear Edna, a year ago last summer, I was engaged in conversation with you at the Swope Summer White House, with crap games to left of us, chemin de fer games to right of us. And you said to me,
'The best thing that could happen to you would be to have you snatched out of the Algonquin and exiled to Kansas City for 2 years. At the end of that time, you'd come back with some fine work.'"
That casual observation so impressed me that I left the Algonquin, where I had lunched practically every day for 6 years. I didn't go to Kansas City, but I did go to work and wrote 2 plays.
He wrote The Road to Rome and The Love Nest. His writing eventually won him 4 Pulitzer Prizes. Too much entertainment and too little work began to take their toll on other Algonquin members. Dorothy Parker's excuse for not writing.
Someone else was using the pencil.
Edna Ferber, on the other hand, had no trouble resisting the enervating embrace of the rich. In 1928, The Royal Family and Showboat were 2 of the biggest hits on Broadway. George S. Kaufman turned out a hit a year no matter what. But he no longer wrote with Mark Connolly, whose constant socializing left little time for work. Eventually, Connolly did write The Green Pastures, an evocation of a black heaven. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 1930.
That's a very long story, and I'll give you my order later. Thank you. Can't you see I'm in the middle of an interview here? Go ahead.
In the 20s, there was little appetite for dark, unpleasant news.
Has anybody seen my gal? Turned up nose, roll down hose, flapper, yes sir, one of those. Has anybody
And then in the summer of 1927, an event occurred that changed the mood of the country. It was the execution of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, Italian immigrants and self-acknowledged anarchists. They were charged with the murder of a paymaster in Braintree, Massachusetts. Convicted in 1921, they remained on death row for 6 years, while an extraordinary series of appeals went through the courts. There was circumstantial evidence, both for and against them. The case divided the country. On one side was the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, backed by those who feared anarchy, Reds and foreigners. On the other, a mixture of artists, liberals, and intellectuals, personified by Felix Frankfurter. The Round Table was divided, too. Wolcott declared the two men guilty. Dorothy Parker was sure they were innocent.
She had an enormous sense of social righteousness. She went up to Boston during the Sacco-Vanzetti troubles and paraded on the street as a protest and got pinched. And the Boston Globe came out with an account of her arrest, referring to her as the Parker woman.
On August 10th, 39 people were arrested for sauntering. When asked if she were guilty, Dorothy Parker replied,
"Well, I did saunter."
Benchley demonstrated too. He offered testimony that one of the judges in the case had made prejudicial remarks in a golf club locker room. There was a stay of execution, but 12 days later, on August 23rd, 1927, Sacco and Vanzetti were put to death.
Dorothy Parker wrote,
I had heard someone say, and so I said it too, that ridicule is the most effective weapon. Well, now I know that there are things that never have been funny and never will be. And I know that ridicule may be a shield, but it is not a weapon.
Heywood had for years believed in social justice. He was convinced that as a columnist, he could influence change. He put his job on the line. He wrote, "We shield our eyes and kill them. We are the dead, and in us there is no feeling, nor imagination, nor the terrible torment of lust for justice. We have a right to beat against tight minds with our fists and shout a word into the ears of the old men. We want to know, we will know, why." His publishers found his zeal excessive and dismissed him. The executions made Dorothy Parker feel that writing about her own personal unhappiness had about run its course. Wisecracks and flippancy began to get her down.
I'm done with this burning and giving, and reeling the rhymes of my woes. And how I'll be making my living, the Lord in his mystery knows.
It was the beginning of the end of the 20s. The Algonquin began to lose its hold on its members.
Well, success hit the Round Table, and they all went in different directions. Some went to California, like Bob Benchley, and a lot of others. They had jobs in different places, and they were successful, and they didn't need the comfort that the Round Table used to give them all.
I don't know. Some of us began going to Hollywood more than we should have, and had just other interests that pulled us away. We never lost our affection for each other. Everybody liked each other. That was the key of the Round Table, was affection, actually.
In Hollywood, in Hollywood, she'll learn that true love means more than Hollywood.
Herman Mankiewicz, an original member of the Round Table group, maintained that everyone initially came to Hollywood in pursuit of a lump sum. Connolly was already on the coast. Edna Ferber sold her work to the movies, Royal Family, Dinner at 8, Cimarron, and in the 50s, Giant. Kaufman went to Hollywood to write A Night at the Opera. When Irving Thalberg, MGM's boy wonder, gave him a deadline for a script, Kaufman quipped,
You want it Wednesday, or do you want it good?
Their brand of tough, cynical humor became a great commodity in Hollywood. But as New Yorkers, they felt trapped there in spite of their successes. Dorothy Parker said,
I just sat in a cell-like office and did nothing. I would imagine the Klondike like that, a place where people rush for gold.
Eventually always kept a suitcase packed, ready for escape to New York, even though he acted in 38 feature films in Hollywood and appeared in dozens of his own comedy shorts.
What are you speaking on this afternoon, Doctor?
On the sex life of the polyp. In order to study the polyp at close range, which is about the only way you can study a polyp, after all, we took one of the tiny creatures home with us to live. It was, at the time, a girl polyp, so we called her Mary, after Ethel Barrymore.
The long party of the 1920s was over. The Round Tablers were momentarily stunned by the crash. They recovered quickly, though, because their work continued to pay well. Alexander Wolcott gave up his column and turned to radio. His show, The Town Crier, was a hit.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. Alexander Wolcott.
Tonight I'm inviting you to come along with me back through the years. We're looking through the window of a building in New York. It's the hive from which the New York Times emerges. Up on the third floor, a bespectacled young man is banging away on a typewriter. I hardly recognize him. His name is Alexander Wolcott. He doesn't know much. I look at him and think of all the time he's going to waste in the 20 years ahead and all the pounds he's going to put on.
Harpo Marx said as he left Neshabe in 1929, he could hardly face another grueling 9 months of all-night poker and all-day croquet, round-table lunches and Long Island weekends, back to the grind of cooking up puns and practical jokes.
The trouble with us is that we stayed young too long.
The Round Tablers worked and produced. They didn't burn out as talents, but the bonds that held them together loosened as America entered the more somber decade of the 30s. Heywood ran for Congress in 1930 as the socialist candidate from the richest district in New York City. He lost, but 3 years later he helped to organize the American Newspaper Guild and became its first president. Harpo Marx said, martial law has been declared against us croquet maniacs and thanatopsians, sitters of the Round Table, and all the other overage children of the world. We were under house arrest. The sentence was abolition of the 20s. The bam, sock, and pow part was over. Our $1 million playground was condemned. One day, a few years later, Edna Ferber came back in here after a long day's work, wanting to celebrate. She flounced up to the old table and sat down where she had so often sat before, and found herself staring at the astonished faces of a family from Newton, Kansas, in town to see the sights. Their 10-year lunch had ended.
Alexander Wolcott, sometimes known as Dorothy Parker's Fat Chance, bidding you good night.